Okay, thank you. Thank you to Glass Tire. We appreciate our sweet sponsors who supported us in so many ways over the years. Welcome. Happy Fall Equinox Eve, as I understand it. I'm Terry Thornton. I'm Curator of Education here at the Modern. I'm so happy to be back together again. This is lovely, I know. Both on-site and online. So to all of our live streamers, we see you. We're happy you're with us. So for this Tuesday evening at the Modern, here we go. We have a wonderful program. I cannot overemphasize tonight. But before we move forward with that, I want to let those of you who know John Knuckles, our AV technician extraordinaire, and critical part of this program, and so much more here at the Modern. I want to let you know that he recently suffered a stroke. And I'm happy to report that he is recovering, and I think showing some very positive signs. He's at Harris Hospital in the Jones Building. No guest yet. But cards and good vibes, I think, are very much welcome. So I just wanted to let you know we look forward to John's return. And in the meantime, two very capable folks have stepped in to fill John's oversized shoes. So I just wanted to fill everybody in on that. And so here we are, and we open this fall Tuesday evening season with an extremely special presentation. No hyperbole there, I promise. So special that we have invited a special guest to give a very special introduction for this museum's and this program's dear friend, Dr. Mark Thistlethwaite. So Dr. Catherine Kraft, distinguished curator at Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, some of you may know, has a significant CV of her own. For example, she has just curated and is about to open the Carol Beauvais show at the Nasher, so get online and check that out. But for tonight, she is here as a former student who has become a friend and colleague of Mark Thistlethwaite's. So with that, and with those bragging rights, I'm going to turn the lectern over to Catherine. Thank you so much, Catherine, for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Terry. As Terry mentioned, I studied with Mark at TCU for my BA in art history in the days before TCU had an MA in art history. And I first met Mark during a campus visit when I was still a high school student. When this talk was originally planned, it was in celebration of Mark's retirement from TCU. So I hope you bear with me for a few thoughts about Mark and what he's done over the years. It goes without saying that Mark was a remarkable teacher during his time at TCU. As the Kay and Velma Kimball Chair of Art History, he received the Chancellor's Award for Distinguished Teaching and the Honors Program's Professor of the Year Award. For students such as myself, the years that followed TCU brought Mark's continued mentoring and professional support. He also stopped me and many others from using too many semicolons. Mark is also a wide-ranging and widely respected scholar in the field of American art, specifically the role that history painting has played and continues to play in our national story. His 1979 book, The Image of George Washington, is still a landmark in this field. Mark's renown in this area struck me just over a decade ago. I was then living in Munich, Germany, and I got an email from Mark letting me know that he would be in town for the Transatlantic Visual Cultures Conference being held at the Bavarian American Academy, where I had the opportunity to see him present his work on Washington, updated to include images of Barack Obama in the White House in front of portraits of Washington, to a gathering of fascinated Germans. In addition to Mark's record as a teacher and scholar, I'd like to mention two things that may not seem obvious, but have had, I realize, a profound effect on me and my work, and I think on our wider community. Both of them concern what I might call Mark's penchant for disregarding conventional intellectual, historical, and cultural boundaries. In the first case, when I started studying art history, I came to learn that there were people who drew a distinction between academic work and museum work. Art history professors that I met after leaving TCU saw the museum world as intellectually inferior, and the museum world saw academia as disconnected from artworks and reality. Especially after I left TCU, going to other schools and other museums, I found that people expected me to choose which one I was going to do. Was I going to go into academia, or was I going to go into museums? And I didn't want to choose, and I still don't. I still think that museum work is also scholarly work, and academia is also about making ideas accessible to all kinds of people. And that's fortunately become much more common now, thankfully. But Mark was, for me, one of the first and one of the best exemplars of this other way of doing things. He didn't so much reject this divide as just act like it didn't exist. He held lectures for his classes at museums and invited the public, and his contributions to museum catalogs were as scholarly and exacting and much more readable than any academic article. The second thing is Mark's engagement with and interest in contemporary art and artists. Again, that's something that seems natural, but it hasn't always been that way. I had lunch last week with an artist in Dallas who, when she learned where I would be tonight, talked about Mark coming to openings in Dallas over the years, and that she would say to him, "What are you doing here?" Because people like him typically didn't show up at those kinds of events. Thanks to Mark, that it's not surprising to think that someone whose field is 19th century American history painting would also be interested in Andy Warhol, Hale Woodruff, Barbara Kruger, Ed and Linda Blackburn, or someone having their very first show. And I would argue that it's this interest in the contemporary that has made it and continues to make it possible for him to discuss artworks from our past in ways that seem so relevant to our present concerns. Publicity for this talk has invited us to guess which 4 paintings Mark will talk about. That it may not be so easy to guess is a tribute to the breadth of his knowledge and his interests. He's been a great teacher, mentor, colleague, and friend, and I look forward to more in years to come. Who knows what he'll do now that he's retired and has all this time? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Thistlethwaite.
Well, I'm ready to leave now. That was very, very gracious. I appreciate it. No surprise, Catherine, or I still call her Kathy, was one of the outstanding students I ever had the privilege of working with. I particularly remember her Blue Book exams, which we all teachers agonize over grading, were unbelievable. And in fact, I had to hunt to find something I could comment on. And ironically, it was semicolons that, that I found was the one weak link. But remarkable, she's done an incredible job as curator at the Nasher as well. And I urge you to, follow their website and follow any exhibitions that she may be involved in. The other thing that, in her comments, I don't know if you remember this, and maybe I'm making it up, but I remember your visit to TCU. And as I recall, when you said you wanted to be an art history major, I said, oh, I wouldn't recommend that. For no good reason except my thinking was a student really shouldn't declare a major till they were sophomores, that they should kind of shop around. Fortunately, she paid no attention to me and went on and did wonderful work, wrote a terrific honors thesis on Max Ernst, and was always a pleasure to have in a class. The title for this evening's talk was originally intended to play upon what was my then approaching retirement last year from TCU, and on the once common university practice of near retirees presenting a last lecture. It sounded so terminal to me, and it reminded me of paintings such as The Last of the Buffalo, The Last of the Race, Last of England, and of course The Last Supper and The Last Judgment. So I wanted to qualify what I was doing by putting in not necessarily, and in a way that was kind of a hope. But due to COVID, the lecture obviously had to be canceled, and here we are tonight. I've added the word still, because I'm still hoping that's in fact true. And before I begin showing the 4 works I've selected, I wanted to emphasize, in a way, playing off what Catherine just said, one of the advantages, great advantages of being an art historian at TCU has been the availability and accessibility of the amazing art museums in Fort Worth as teaching resources. I've had the good fortune of introducing a multitude of students to our art museums and been able to teach numerous courses that utilize the art museum as its semester-long classroom, meeting at a museum rather than at TCU. And nothing beats studying art like doing it in person, even if you're on the floor. If you're trying to develop and enhance a student's ability to look at a work of art closely and analyze it, it makes all the difference to be in front of the objects themselves. I love the museum as a classroom, and recently I came across another way of thinking about the museum that I really like. This is a comment made by a Danish museum director. He said regarding the art museum that it really is a mental fitness center, a place where you can not only train and strengthen your abilities to see and think creatively and critically, but also fortify your emotional and imaginative intelligence. And I really like that notion. Setting a course in an art museum also provides the opportunity to make that environment, which for many students is not a familiar one, and sometimes an intimidating one. But you can make that a more familiar place, and you can also make it a potential site for lifelong learning and pleasure. For me, having classes in the art museums has been extraordinarily rewarding and has really immensely enriched my teaching and my learning. I meant to show. There. Just some examples of students from classes. So, I'm going to share with you 4 works from 4 Fort Worth art museums, the Carter, the Richardson, the Modern, the Kimball, that I find myself continually drawn to. These are not necessarily my favorite works of art, but rather they're works that rise to, or give rise for me to sensations of resonance and wonder. And that's a phrase, resonance and wonder, that I'm taking from a 1991 article by the literary historian Stephen Greenblatt, in which he identifies wonder as the power of museum displayed objects to stop us in our tracks and to evoke an exalted attention. Resonance, on the other hand, he characterizes as when an art object stimulates a sense of reaching out beyond its formal boundaries to a larger world, to evoke in the viewer the complex, dynamic forces from which the artwork has emerged and represents. For me, such a work is one that I've been long intrigued by at the Sid Richardson Museum, and that is the Self-Portrait by Frederick Remington from around 1890. I'm captivated by what it suggests about Remington, the artist, and Remington, the man, and the era that he lived in. Here we see how this 30-year-old Frederick Remington has fashioned himself as a mounted Western cowboy. A powerful sense of the austerity and the aridness of the land and the solitariness of the figure pervades the composition. He presents himself as a rugged individualist in a harsh, unforgiving environment, yet one which implicitly is to be tamed. The composition's stock still manner differs markedly from the action-packed images we associate typically with Remington's work. And I'm showing maybe. There. Now it's going to jump ahead maybe. I'm showing a painting from the Amon Carter Museum that has more of that kind of dramatic, dynamic quality we often think in Remington's work. Remington offers a self-representation unlike that we typically see in self-portraiture, which often shows an artist in their studio, as in this Paul Gauguin painting in the Kimball, in some ways remarkably just a few years earlier than Remington's, worlds apart in every other way. But more typical, we find an artist who, as Gauguin seems to be in this painting, looking off to the side, probably at a mirror, to do a mirror image of himself as he's working in his garret in Denmark, it happens to be at this time. Remington's figure on horseback fits well within the tradition, the old tradition, centuries-old tradition of equestrian portrait paintings. And I'm showing a work from the Kimball, the Rubens painting, another work from the Carter, and then the Modern's terrific painting by Kehinde Wiley. All of these within the mode of equestrian portraiture. What's fascinating to me about the Remington is that, and I have spent unbelievable hours online checking, it's the only artist's self-portrait on horseback prior to the 20th century that I've come across. And I've looked at thousands of these images. So it's, in a way, a very unusual, if not unique, work. In his self-image, Remington, his gaze is really, I think, arresting and assessing us, while we recognize how easily he assumes one-handed command of his mount on a rocky terrain environment that slopes both away and towards us. His control of and unity with his horse is complemented by his implicit mastery of the land, as suggested by him projecting his body above the horizon line. He plants himself and his horse right in the middle of the composition, as if to stake his claim on the West as his subject matter. Remington's success in mining Western subject was confirmed just a couple of years, maybe a year and a half after this painting in an article in Scribner's magazine, which declared, I'm quoting, Eastern people have formed their conceptions of what far Western life is like more from what they have seen in Mr. Remington's pictures than in any other source. And if they went west, they would expect to see men and places exactly as Mr. Remington has drawn them. It's important to remember that, like his audience, Frederick Remington was an Easterner, born and bred, and he produced his paintings in studios in New York and Connecticut. Whoops, there. This is showing him riding what I think is an English saddle, wearing a bowler, on his estate in New Rochelle, New York. It's an undated work and later than the image. We're reminded of the self-fashioning that occurs in any portraiture, but with Remington, he's constructed his image by including chaps, a rifle, a hat, and blocking his massive upper body by the horse's head. Remington mythologizes himself as a real cowboy and a manly man in an era when a male artist was often regarded as a feat. By occupying the middle of the composition, Remington personifies the centrality of the cowboy in his vision of the American West, which metaphorically is the artist's studio. Remington portrays himself projecting a self-confident authority that cinches his role as the West's central visual mythmaker. And speaking of myth, this is probably one most people guessed I might talk about. This is one of the most unusual paintings in the Carter's collection, and one that continually fills me with wonder and resonance. This is Parson Weems' Fable by Grant Wood from 1939. It's also a painting that I was looking at and wondering about even before I moved to Fort Worth, because it turned out this was a key work in an exhibition that I curated at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts as part of their bicentennial celebration in 1976. And you can see its placement actually in the center there. I was delighted to be able to have it loaned, and I spent many hours wondering what the heck is going on in this work. And if you're very sharp-eyed, you might recognize in the upper right is a painting that's now in the Dallas Museum of Art by William Ramy from the mid-19th century. Grant Wood takes his subject matters from the writings of Mason Locke Weems, who was a minister, author, and bookseller extraordinaire. Published in early 1800, just months after George Washington died, Weems's account of Washington became a bestseller and went through something like 70 editions by the middle of the 19th century. Everyone read it literally. In the 6th edition of 1808, Weems identified himself as formerly rector of Mount Vernon Parish. He was not, and there was no such position. In the previous edition of 1860, Weems first included the "I cannot tell a lie" myth. Even though he either invented or plagiarized it, Weems introduced the cherry tree anecdote in the text by declaring it is too valuable to be lost and too true to be doubted. He made it up. Father Washington is seen praising his son for telling the truth. He fessed up to chopping what turned out to be, of course, his father's favorite cherry tree, not any cherry tree. And his father, who had been teaching him about truthfulness, considered his son's confession to be, as Weems writes, an act of heroism. In a later edition, the book also indicated in its title it was aimed at the nation's young people. So it was a myth to grow up with. Weems' anecdote became a national myth. That is, a symbolic narrative that sanctified national origins and provided a model to guide public thinking and behavior. Grant Wood conveys the artifice, the fiction of the story by painting an unbelievably immaculate astroturf-like landscape, an exaggerated perspective, obviously theatrical gestures, and a surrealistic figure of a 6-year-old boy with the head of a 64-year-old dead white male. It's at once humorous and serious. The picture manifests the artist's concern, and I'm quoting Wood here, that a valuable and colorful part of our national heritage is being lost as a result of the work of analytical historians and debunking biographers, end quote. Wood went on to state that the painting aimed not only to reassert America's mythic heritage, but also to reaffirm the nation's uniqueness at the very moment when Europe was entering or about to enter a Second World War. Wood writes, in our present unsettled times when democracy is threatened on all sides, the preservation of folklore is more important than generally realized. The storm clouds in the upper left are often seen as portending the impending war. In contriving his composition, Wood surely looked at some of the multitude of prints and illustrations of the cherry tree story that proliferated throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, such as this one in particular from 1867. And he certainly was inspired by this life-size portrait, self-portrait, by Charles Wilson Peale, showing Peale in his museum, painted in 1822. Very direct. Wood probably did not know this painting firsthand, probably knew it through reproductions. And in fact, sort of when he was at the moment of still working on his composition, this work appeared in Life magazine in color. And likely he may have seen it there, but he may have seen it other places. Wood's painting was absolutely timely, for during the 1930s, Washington's image was ubiquitous. In the year of the painting, 1939, the New York World's Fair, for instance, featured a 6-story statue of Washington. And earlier in 1932, in celebration of the bicentennial year of Washington's birth, 1 million reproductions of Gilbert Stuart's famous 1796 Athenaeum portrait were distributed to school children. So it was hard not to see Washington during this time, and Wood was clearly playing upon that knowledge. Just as a footnote, I've always found it wonderful and serendipitous that the boy who posed to convey the moral character of the young Washington would later in life become the very Reverend James Parks Morton, Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, who, according to him, actually held a crowbar and not a hatchet in his hand. Another kind of connection with that cathedral is again a very odd one. In 2006, vandals entered the cathedral and beheaded a statue of George Washington that was in the cathedral and left a dollar bill on the statue. They knew that that was the real Washington, the dollar bill, Stuart Washington. Grant Wood's Parson Weems' fable, and his work in general, and Parson Weems in particular perhaps, has generated a resurgence of academic interest over the last decade, 2010 on. There's been a great interest in his work. And scholars have taken a variety of approaches, including reading the painting through the lens of queer theory, and psychoanalyzing Wood's relationships with his mother and his father. Shirley Reese Hughes of the Eamon Carter Museum has linked the artist's work to theater. I've written about its parallels to contemporary advertising layouts and the concept of kitsch. That's what I talked about in Germany, actually. They thought this was the weirdest painting they'd ever seen. Others have discussed Wood's work in terms of American humor during the Depression, and recently, an article in the Hastings Law School, a journal of race and poverty law, raises the specter of black lynchings in regard to shadows. I should be showing you this. Shadows, the really strange shadows you see from father and son. So it's been a work on the radar of a lot of historians recently. Who would expect less from a visual parody about a fabricated story about the importance of being truthful? In 1934, 5 years before this painting, Gertrude Stein described Grant Wood's art as one of devastating satire. Woods disliked the term satirist. And he said, "Of course, I have been satirical, but I have to keep on insisting I am not a satirist." He may not have considered himself a satirist, but when he finished Parson Weems' fable, it was almost immediately purchased by Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist John P. Marquand, who was considered at the time America's foremost satirist. So I think it takes a satirist to know a satirist. Turning now to the Kimball for something completely different, a wonderful example of what was an extraordinarily radical movement, Cubism, in the early 20th century, is Picasso's Man with a Pipe of 1911. Again, a work that I have found myself standing in front of many, many times, and also listening to people's comments about it as they move quickly past. It's also, part of the resonance with the work is knowing how Picasso was a child prodigy and how throughout his long career and prolific career, 40,000 works of art probably, he changed constantly, sort of the personification of modernism, and always trying to innovate, to be original, and so forth. Cubism breaks with that Renaissance notion of the window on the world, the fixed view of the world, the logic of the gaze, things stable. Cubism, on the other hand, is actively shifting relationships. It's unsettling perspectives. It's more of a glance than a gaze. It's a very active kind of it puts the viewer in a very active kind of place. The critic, John Berger, long ago refers to viewers making visual forays. You go into it, you can go so far, and then you have to come out. You have to go back again. This is a painting on the right that Picasso did when he was 16 years old. The Kimball also has a work very closely related in that, but it's by Georges Braque. He and Picasso really co-invented Cubism. They saw themselves, as they said, like two mountaineers roped together, and for several years they would get together and talk about their work and discuss it. And in certain works, they're very hard to tell apart. And in fact, when there was this great pioneering Cubism show at MoMA in 1990, the critic and philosopher Arthur Danto described a lot of the work as, or he wrote an article really, but he described the work as being braquasso in nature. It's a work that has, resonated with people in terms of, is it a portrait of somebody in particular? Is it simply a man with a pipe? Guillaume Apollinaire, one of the friends of Picasso, who just coincidentally in 1911, he and Picasso had to go before the police in regard to the theft of the Mona Lisa and defend themselves. They were not involved. But it has been argued that it might be Apollinaire. That's debatable, to be sure. And one of the things, or some of the things that really strike me about this work and why I spend a lot of time looking at it, is because of the kind of dynamics that it has and its kind of here and there quality. Picasso once defined cubism as being like perfume. It's in front of you, it's behind you, it's to the sides. The scent is everywhere, you can't tell where it's coming from. The metaphor I've always used in teaching is that of driving a car, which is kind of scary to link to cubism, I guess. The idea you're seatbelted in a car, you're in a stable position, but you're moving through space, you're looking ahead, your vision is also going side to side, you're using mirrors to look at the past. So in a way, you're moving from past, present to future, and it's all kind of happening simultaneously. And it's a kind of metaphor for the flux of modernity. This is a moment when you have incredible technological changes. The telephone has been around for a generation now, but still the idea of talking to somebody in one place and they're in a totally different space is new. Not that Picasso would have known it, but Einstein's theories of special relativity and general relativity were 1905, and then a little bit later, 1916. The Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega Gasset made the statement, there are as many realities as there are perspectives. This idea of flux, of flow, of a sense of what one writer has called, in another context, the frenzy of the visible. It really is part of this work, and also characterizes this work a bit, I think, as well. And this is, some of you may have seen this work fairly recently. This is the work by Jekadika, I knew I was going to mess that up, Akuni Ely Crosby. A terrific painting, I think, a very large painting, combining drawing, painting, fabric collage, acetone prints on paper. Very complex, very layered, very dense in what's going on. And yet it also has this kind of order to it in the kind of precise lines that she draws and defines spatial arrangements. They're cleanly rendered, and yet there are also these seemingly random elements, particularly the transfers that appear on the floor, what we read partly as a floor, and in the background. She sits, this is a self-portrait, she sits among a surge almost of these visual images that carpet the floor. And she includes, some funny things in a way, like the bobblehead figure of the football player Colin Kaepernick, and the controversy over his taking a kneel and relating it to Black Lives Matter. She is Nigerian by birth. She's been in the United States for quite a few years. And she considers herself a transcultural individual, very cosmopolitan, very much a citizen of the world in many ways. This painting, some of you that saw the focus show that Alison Hurst did quite a while back, a few years now, saw this pairing. The work on the left-hand side now, as you see, is in the Baltimore Museum of Art. It's her in both cases wearing the same dress. And again, she's talked consistently about how it is to live in two worlds, go back and forth between these two worlds, negotiating these. Both of these are, well, I shouldn't say both of them. The one is her Nigerian background coming through. The other is her LA apart when she moved to Los Angeles in 2014. She incorporates both Nigerian and United States symbols, signs, images through clippings from magazines on hairstyles, fashions, architecture, furnishings that she's, and her own photographs, oftentimes, again, from both Nigerian and American sources. She likes the idea of trying to not only represent her duality, but to speak to multiple audiences. Not everyone's going to get the Nigerian imagery. Not everyone who's Nigerian is going to get the American imagery. So she's trying to create work that moves back and forth between the two. It is in some ways an unusual self-portrait by her positioning. There's no sense of a studio environment in this work, as there wasn't in the Remington, although this is very different. It's a domestic environment, and much of her work is dealing with domesticity and interiors. It's a work that actually put me in mind of this gorgeous painting in the Kimball, Lebron Self-Portrait, which again, like Cornelia Crosby's work, really there are no attributes of her being an artist. Rather, she's dressed in, actually it's an outfit from the West Indies, which gives it a kind of cosmopolitan flavor to it, very stylish. She has talked about the influence of Western art on her. She's very articulate. I would encourage you to look her up on YouTube. There's a great conversation she has with the director of the British Center at Yale. Very articulate, very thoughtful, very knowledgeable of the history of art, and references it constantly in terms of not so much appropriating it, but a kind of inspiration that she's drawn from it. I can't help but think of this painting by Monet of Zola in terms of the kind of pose and the home aspect of what she's depicting here. And then just a couple of others. It's fun as an art historian to think about other images that would relate and resonate. And she's talked about a lot of these, not this particular work, but this particular artist, Villa. She's talked about the impact his work has had on her. There is a decorative sensibility about her work. She is much more defined in her linear elements than you might find in that earlier French painter. I can't help but think of Hockney when I see some of her work, particularly this. And Hockney, of course, when he painted this work from 1966-67, was a transplant from Britain to LA. So in a way, a kind of similar situation. And then also Rauschenberg, and particularly with the print transfers, that becomes very much part of her work, part of Rauschenberg's work. This is one of the great pieces in the collection here, and I brought in a detail of hers with a little bit closer view of Rauschenberg's work. Her work, again, I mean, visually it's just extraordinary, I think, and fascinating how the transfers both kind of pop out, but they also flatten the composition at the same time. How they cause you to move forward and try to read them. You know, is that Angela Davis? Who is that? Who's that figure? You know, how, what's going on in the composition. The dog, by the way, I should mention that in Nigeria, dogs are used primarily for herding and hunting and guarding, and not so much as domestic pets. So this is a kind of her statement about being Americanized by having the dog in it. She's also very much influenced by literature, and that was fascinating to me, and she speaks about it often in interviews, in part because I just sort of, not by accident, it was our daughter recommended, but I read a book by, what's her name, Adichie, Chimamanda Adichie, called Half a Yellow Sun, which is about the war in Biafra. It's a novel. And it's very, Adichie is an artist that Crosby really admires, and talks about how Nigerian writers, particularly Adichie, and also Chinua Achebe, in his books, Things Fall Apart, or The Arrow of God in particular, they're different perspectives. The colonial perspective, the Igbo perspective, and the religious and the secular, and all of these different perspectives they deal with. And I think that's part of what she's really moving towards and trying to establish in her work. And then it's just sort of knockout, beautiful work that, sort of at least takes my breath away sometimes. Also mentioned, I brought this detail in particular because you can see the crinkling of the paper. She works on paper, very large scale compositions, but on paper. And it's an interesting, it adds a kind of almost vernacular quality to it, a sort of a public aspect, like a big poster, a very grand poster. She does it in part because that's the acetone transfers work on paper well. But it's an interesting, it moves away from the kind of cleanness, we might say, of the edges that most of her work has. As I say, for me, it's really fascinating work. So those are my 4 choices. And I have to say, I didn't change them. I thought I would. When Terry said we're going to, postpone it, I thought, oh, good, I'll have a chance to go back and rethink this. And I ended rethinking and ended up with the same thoughts. So, although I have to say, I keep changing them. And I must say, they have also inspired me to continue to learn more about each of these artists' works. It's absolutely fascinating. So I thank you for coming, and I thank you for your attention. It's an honor to start off the series. I hope you come back. It looks like a really good set of programming. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to attempt to, yes?
Presentation on the portrait by Grant Wood was impressive, but you didn't comment on the presentation of 2 black figures in the background. Grant Wood, in the American Gothic, had a series of symbolisms. He was very prolific in the symbolisms. So, in your comment about, historical comments about Parson Williams, my question is, should art live in the present and the future, or should art simply live in the past?
Yes, no, and maybe. I don't mean to be flip. Art is, it always exists in a context, and it always exists in a cultural context. And art historians are now looking at this work is because we're of a different era. And we see it differently than was seen at the time. And so, as an art historian or as a teacher, I'm always trying to balance that of the point of view I have today with, well, what do the people at the time think about it? This whole issue of Grant Wood's homosexuality, for example. Some people were written very directly about him being gay. Others have said, no, he wasn't gay because that wasn't even a term that was used as sexual identity at that particular time. So he's queer, and that means outsiders and so forth. So I think it's a kind of a balancing act between the figures you're talking about. In a way, they haven't actually been discussed all that much, except for the one article I mentioned in the Hastings Law Journal, which they make a very long argument with all sorts of legal sidebars about the shadows being a lynched black man. It's not particularly convincing. And they admit there's no real evidence to support what they're saying other than what they see. And one of the things that, again, in teaching art history, and you're thinking about critical thinking, you're thinking, well, what makes a good interpretation? It's got to be plausible, there's got to be some evidence, and it has to be convincing.
And it has to be relevant to the top today.
Yes, because
To be considered an art.
Yeah. But I think you're right to point out those figures because you could say, from our perspective, particularly, look, he's drawing attention to the fact that Washington's father was a slave owner, and Washington himself was. It's sort of implicating in that way, whether he intended it or not. But I have to say, I'm really glad you mentioned it, because that ladder, I never see it and not think of the Merton Courier ladder for Booker T. Washington with its skewed perspective.
Sure.
There's also one other figure back in the orchard. You can't see it in the slide, but it's back there. Yeah, to kind of explain what you're saying, maybe, works of art are in a sense living forms because we're looking at we're trying to find out more about them. In a way, they're evolving. I mean, they're static. But how we read them, certainly, is conditioned by our times. What our expectations are. I mean, it's like, why did Titian not paint geometric abstract paintings? It was beyond the horizon of expectations. And nobody thought of it. Nobody had that. And so, again, it's kind of you're bound in part by your time.
Is there any advice you would give to art historians who are new to teaching? Teaching art history, teaching in general?
Could you hear the question?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, is there any advice I could give to young art historians who are just beginning to teach? One is be well prepared, and you can never be too well prepared because someone will ask a question that you have no idea, and that's when you say, "Great question, look it up and get back to me." And then you go look it up too to make sure they haven't gone to Bobby's website, taken out of some strange thing. The other thing, I think it's important to try to engage the students as much as you possibly can, and make sure they're understanding what you're saying, and check in with them kind of constantly. Is this clear? Because art history has a jargon of its own that we internalize and we don't think about that much until somebody says, well, what the heck is a picture plane? And so just so everyone will get that, everyone understand that. And I think it helps to be enthusiastic also. If you approach it that this is an opportunity to affect young people to begin to consider being lifelong learners, that's it, make it really fun. There are probably a bunch of other things. Don't be late for class.
Mark enjoyed your discussion of the Remington portrait, and so you could have just as easily though maybe picked a Russell instead of a Remington, because it seems like, all fans of Old West Art have to choose between either Remington or Russell. But just like film buffs have to choose between Chaplin and Keaton, So are you do you generally choose Remington over Russell, or was it this particular one?
Yes, I generally do. I always do. What I like about Russell are his watercolors. And these watercolors are quite nice. His sort of later Maxfield Parrish psychedelic colors. It took me a long time to come back to Remington. Remington has not been a favorite of art historians. It's kind of ebbed and flowed. And for a long time, something like abstract expressionism was overwhelming everything. Remington was considered very passe. I actually grew up in a house where in my room, my mother had put up 4 Remington prints. And so I grew up with it. One of them is the Sioux Chief, Richardson. And I grew up with him. But I also grew up at a time when, cowboys and Indians is a big thing. We watched it. And then I clearly moved away from considering Remington. And it's only been in recent years. I've had a wonderful opportunity. Mary Burke, who was the then director at the Richardson, had the idea of doing an exhibition of Remington's Eastern paintings. And I thought, I could do that. There's been a lot of Western, let's look at that, another frontier. It was a really enlightening show. And I'm working now, actually, with Scott Winterman at the Richardson on a small exhibition dealing with Remington's last decade of his life and the idea of night and day, scenes of night and day, and climbing them off the mountain. So for me, it's an exciting project. But I have friends on the East Coast who, when I say Remington, say, "Gosh, how long have you lived there?" Yeah. Yes.
Could you say just a few words about, in these 4 works, the artist's use of color, maybe their choice about color relative to their subject matter?
Okay, let me back and go forward here. Well, Picasso we can just skip over. And that was a criticism of Cubism, that it was the soupy brown stuff. And why, in a way, we moved to collage, which became more color involved. But in a way, it absolutely works for Cubism because of, it's really about fragmenting form, and it's about color. If you look at other cubists, say Metzendier or Green, they all use more color, and color oftentimes makes form a little bit more substantial. And what Picasso and rock are interested in, I think, is this idea of fraction. I think with rock, they said we're going to throw a brick through the Renaissance window on the world. And so color isn't that important. It's more of this fragmentation of form. And it's not a puzzle picture that you put back together. It's a picture you just kind of experience. And you can see the little bit of color is the white with the AL, which is probably a reference to the newspaper La Journal, and a few other elements. But he's really limiting the palette. He also does, and this is something Rock initiated, but the oval format. It's a nice way of not having to deal with corners, and it keeps it fluid. I would encourage you to go to the museums and see these slides are all a little bit washed out, as I said. But the Remington is using color to really indicate, as I mentioned, the arrogance of that environment and the kind of forbidding nature of that environment that he now has control over. Nothing's cloudy. it's rocky, it's desolate. In actual fact, those gray rocks have bluish tints to them. And then just that blank, flat blue sky, which, kind of, in a way stops you. It's not like in other paintings of his where you have these grand mystics. He's bringing it all forward. It's all about him. It's his self-portrait. So he's using limited color. Grant Wood is just using color, I would say, in a way to, he's using color partly to move your eye around. He uses red, the red coat, the red part of the hatchet, the red drapery. He's also using circular tones. The drapes have cherries on them, basically. The cherry tree, the circular part of it, the background, all of these elements. The colors are meant to be descriptive. You may even be playing on the notion of because according to Weems's story, the cherry tree was an English cherry tree. And the idea of a red coat on his father would be a kind of, sort of play on that. And then who really Crosby's work, she's got a lot of flat colors, which again play wonderfully off all that visual frenzy on the floor that, sort of, she and the dog are completely ignoring, but in fact this is her life and snippets of it and what she grew up with in pop culture and so forth. And she's using color to really highlight that dress, which is a Nigerian outfit. And sort of that's partly defining who she is in this movie and everything. So colors used, I would say the three of them works in a more descriptive way. And then the areas and
I would respond to Phoebe's question about you as a teacher, your demonstration, as I've seen it over the years, would be your just undeniable passion for art. So loving art is super important by Mark's example, and your demonstration of your enthusiasm almost can't be contained. That has to be contagious. That has to bring some in. And then, as somebody who works in a museum and has always used to appreciate the fact that you won't, you kind of just won't teach it from the books or from the slides. That's not good enough. And it feels like to me that that's because you love the work too much. It's so genuine. You want them to be there in front of it. So to answer his question, by what I've witnessed over the years.
Thank you. We'll go on for it.
Yeah.
I do find, actually, I would say, and again, it's a privilege we have in Fort Worth that we can be in these things and talk about it. But I find talking in front of art, in front of a group, like students, is very good. I enjoy that immensely. You can't make the art historical visual connections, but you can talk about the work itself in a way. I enjoy that, which is, it's funny because when Ramy and I go through a museum, she wants to talk to me. And it's always like, and I go through museums very quickly. I like to say I have fast eyes. And meet you in a cafe. But if I have good students, I really enjoy that a lot.